questions, probably, on YouTube. The panel entitled "The Middle East Through the Lens of Discourse and Media," and in this panel, during the panel, we are going to host three distinguished panelists, and we are going to discuss the media and the discourse, especially by taking into consideration the Arab Spring. And we have Cemre AYSEL. Her paper title is "The Gap Between Discourse and Practices, the Obama Administration During Libya Intervention." Our second speaker will be Mustafa Onur TETİK. His title is "Turkey's Rhetorical Entrapment in Eastern Mediterranean Politics." And our last speaker will be Hussein AL-AHMAD. His paper's title is "The Mediatisation of Palestinian Split in Pan-Arab Transnational Satellite TV Journalism." So, and I would like to give the floor to Miss Miss Cemre. Cemre, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for this conference. It was a really lovely conference. And in a second, I will share my screen. Yes.
All right.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Then I will begin. Today, I will talk about the gap between discourse and practice. As a case study, I will examine the Obama administration during Libya intervention. I will follow this outline. First, I will mention about the puzzle, what has interested me in this question, and then I will briefly talk about method. Then I will examine the literature, what has been said so far about this gap. And finally, I will talk about the case, the Obama administration during Libya intervention. Firstly, I will talk about puzzle, as I said. What has interested me in this question was that why is there a gap between discourse and practice? As we all know, politicians use discourses and say things that they might not do or they will not do in the future, but still there is this discourse that are always mentioned. As I said, discourse sometimes appears more vigorous, where practice action remains short of. I will specifically examine the Obama administration because we all know the Obama administration began with strong claims about the duty to lead by example. They emphasized on democratic and free world. However, many have questioned the Obama administration's ability to pursue a coherent foreign policy that is compatible with the discourses produced by Obama. Actually, this interview was also I was interested in also this interview because here Obama said that intervening in Libya to prevent a massacre was the right thing to do, but doing it without sufficient follow-up on the ground to manage Libya's transition to more democratic politics is probably his biggest foreign policy regret. In my method part, I use inductive causal explanation. This means I first examined the data and later I found out the possible causal mechanism. I use mixed methodology, process tracing, and discourse analysis. Process tracing, as we all know, gives in-depth understanding of sequence of events, and critical discourse analysis allows us to focus on what has been said and what was the conveyed meaning. In my literature review, I find 5 different explanations about why the gap between discourse and practice exists. First one is that post-structuralism argued that discourse actually drives the margins of action. So they contend that if there is a gap, this is due to the multiplicity of discourses at the same time. So if there are multiple discourses from different actors at the same time, the practice might be different for those discourses because there are so many realities for them. And the second strand of literature was constructivism and some rational choice scholars. They talked about unintended consequences. So even though you mean something, it may have some unintended consequences in the practice. This wasn't really scientifically established area, so I didn't really put much think into it. And they talked about rhetorical entrapment, and it refers to being constrained by the arguments and compelled to behave according to them. So if you say something, you have to behave according to it. But if you can't, if you don't have enough resources or you can't mobilize resources, you are somehow rhetorically entrapped. The third strand of literature was about the misunderstanding the relationship between components of discourse and practice. Here we have a bunch of case studies. They are generally about European Union and Middle East during Arab Spring. They argue that the incoherent, for example, the incoherent attitude of the EU results from the misunderstood relationship between stability and democracy and human rights provision. So they argued that although in practice you may promote human rights, this does not directly mean that it will lead to stability and democracy in a way. And the thought that the normative principles of democracy and human rights lead to stability and security. So they argued that that's why these different actors in the region had this gap between discourse and practice. And the last strand of literature was actually about strategic culture studies. There are 3 waves of strategic culture studies, and this one is the second one. Strategic culture is being used as a tool for political hegemony to manipulate matters, they argue. They argue that there is a vast difference between what leaders think or say they are doing and the deeper motives for what in fact they do. They also argue that there are different subcultures, sub-strategic cultures in a state, so they might be in clash with them, so there might be different results than the expected one. Bradley Klein actually gives an example of this. He examines the case of American nuclear policy and finds out that their actual operational strategies stressed warfighting in defense of American hegemony's interests, while declaratory strategy was used instrumentally by political elites to fashion a culturally and linguistically acceptable justification. So they emphasize the instrumental usage of strategic culture and the instrumental usage of discourses. We have also here York's work on symbolic containment of the nuclear threat, and here she talks about Reagan's administration's way to get support for the strategic defense initiative. So this concludes my literature. Before going on to the case, I want to give a general outlook just briefly to emphasize certain things. So Obama, even before holding the post in 2007, argued for more funding to be set aside to ensure the transition to democracy for peoples. In 2009, he said people are seeking for freedom and self-determination and that they're reaching out for those rights should not remain unanswered. In 2009, there is violence and injustice in our world that must be confronted, accept our responsibility to leave this world more prosperous and more peaceful than we found it. And again, in 2013, advancing the values we believe in this century, these are the citizens who long to join the free world. As we all can see, there are strong emphasis on the US values, the freedom, the people's right to be free and democracy. So it was the general zeitgeist of the Obama administrations. In my case analysis, as I said, I examined the Libya intervention, and here I will talk about the discourse during the intervention. In 23 February, there are actually long speeches given by Obama to the press or in conference, but I will just mention the bold passages. So he said that these actions violate, talking about Gaddafi, these actions violate international norms and every standard of common decency. As we see, there's again the emphasis on values, and the United States will continue to stand up for freedom, stand up for justice, and stand up for the dignity of all people. Again, he's mentioning freedom and that United States have this duty. In 18th March, the democratic values that we stand for, if we don't overthrow Gaddafi, that was the main subject, will be overrun. So again, with values, in 20th March, he talks about we cannot stand idly by when a tyrant tells his people that there will be no mercy. As we can see, these are speeches that repeatedly talks about values, responsibility of the US. In 26 March, he says, when the international community is prepared to come together to save many thousands of lives, then it is in our national interest to act, and it is our responsibility. And this is one of those times talking about Libya. And in 28 March, he says, doing what's right is important, although there are accusations that US should not be everywhere. So he repeatedly, as I said, talks about doing what is right, values, and that he has a responsibility to those people who seek for freedom and democracy. However, when we came to the practice during the intervention, we see that firstly, Obama was reluctant about the intervention. Only after Arab unions called that they began together and decided to start the intervention by calling a no-fly zone. Firstly, it was US-led intervention, but 2 weeks later, the intervention began. The command of the intervention passed from the US to NATO forces. This was directly related to the light footprint and burden sharing principle. So Obama repeatedly said that they will not do the mistakes of Bush administrations in Iraq, and they will not send American soldiers to the soil, and that they will make other countries responsible for the happenings in the soil too. By sharing the burden of the intervention with France and Britain, Obama ensured the goal of conserving US strength in time of economic crisis and military overstretch. As we all know, military overstretch is always a hot topic in the US, since there are opponents that argue that US should stay alone in its continent and shouldn't interfere with others. And during the intervention, US forces was used only air power as a part of NATO. Here, objective using them only as air power, objective of using them as only air power was to make sure the continuation of no-fly zone area and conducting airstrikes against regime forces that threaten populated areas. And we see that only 35% of NATO's total operation was conducted by the US actually. So what do we find from both discourses and the practice that we see? We see the strong emphasis on freedom and democracy. We see that values of US lead America to interfere with the happenings, and helping Libyans is actually a must. They have to do that because there are people who seek for their help, who seek for democracy. So we see that moral reasons actually on the discourse, as we can see, was the main force driving the intervention. However, when we see the practice, it was more pragmatic. Light footprint and burden sharing principles were things that sound pragmatic because they don't send the full force to Libya to fix whatever they see as wrong. And although the light footprint was mentioned many times in Obama's speech, it never meant the ineffective usage of military. On the contrary, they argued that they will do whatever they can do, but rather it must imply behaving pragmatically, that is in clash with the moral reasons that they mentioned. So why the gap exists? As I said, I will first examine the data and then I will try to find the causal mechanism behind it. In my literature review, there were 5 different strands in the literature about why the gap exists. So we had post-structuralism argument that says if there are multiple discourses that may lead to confusion in the practice, but here we don't see multiple discourses. On the contrary, we see a one-focused discourse on the intervention that emphasized morality. Secondly, we had constructivist arguments, said that if there might be rhetorical entrapment, but we again don't see rhetorical entrapment because US did not do what it argued for. And third strand of the literature was actually about the mismatch between the components of discourse and practice. We mentioned how even though you might promote democracy, it may still not to end up with democracy. But here, Obama himself argued that they should have used more force on the ground to make sure the transition to democracy prevailed. There wasn't a mismatch between discourse and practice. On the contrary, they were matching, but they just didn't send enough forces on the ground to make sure that the transition to democracy prevails. So our last argument actually fits more as a reason for the gap. Strategic culture studies, as we mentioned. Here, strategic culture refers to the use of force and ideologies and how ideologies and discourse is used as a manipulation by political elites for hegemonic ideas. They argue the sub-strategic cultures that might exist in a national context. For America, it was internationalism and isolationism, and these were the two of the other strategic cultures. So, as we can see, Obama's discourse as a political tool to persuade masses to get support. As we all know that that manifest destiny is a really important concept for America, that they have to somehow spread democracy to other parts of the world. So this is a sub-strategic culture for America, and this is what we can see in actually discourse. However, other sub-strategic cultures with the experiences of Afghanistan and Iran, because Obama repeatedly says that he won't do the mistakes of Bush administration, the previous administrations. He won't drag American soldiers to the soil. And this sub-strategic culture actually showed itself in the practice. So this might be the reason for the perceived gap between discourse and practice. Thank you for listening.
Okay, Cemre, thank you. Thanks so much for your very fruitful analysis about the discourse analysis of Obama administration foreign policy vis-a-vis Libya. I think we are going to discuss in the Q&A session if we are going to be received some questions from the audience. Okay, thank you again. Mustafa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor. Hello, everyone. I would like to thank first for the Sakarya University Middle East Institute for this Congress and letting us present our works here. Today I will talk about Turkey's rhetorical entrapment in Eastern Mediterranean politics. My topic is that. My outline, I will start with my outline. First, I will summarize the current situation in Eastern Mediterranean today. So energy, alliances, cooperation, and Turkey's counter policies. Then I will start with some conceptual clarification, like rhetorical entrapment. Then I will put like this Israel, I will talk about the Israel and Egypt in Turkey's discourses, how they had place in Turkey's discourses. Then I will come to the conclusions, like how Turkey's rhetorical entrapment happened with these discourses and this rhetorical entrapment's consequences. So current situation in Eastern Mediterranean today, just I will give a brief summary of it. Israel and Greece have begun to become warmer, their relations become warmer, particularly after 2010. Maybe some of you remember they had some troubles, especially Greece enduring pro-Palestinian policies and the stance. And Greece wanted the pipelines for Israeli discoveries of gas, plus Egypt and Cyprus gas, to pass through its soil instead of Turkey. You know that in 2009 and 11, there was this new discoveries of gas for Israel and southern Cyprus. So shared geopolitical objectives like counterbalancing Turkey in the region, supported by the energy interests, also like approximated this Greek administration in southern Cyprus and Israel, not just Israel, Greece, but also Greek Cypriots and Israel. So they signed a maritime delimitation agreement in 2010, and the Greek Cypriots and Israel also agreed on to find a feasible way for an energy corridor from Israel to Europe to bypass Turkey. So they organized this trilateral summits and they signed some agreements about that. Besides, also Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt teamed up regarding this energy and geopolitical issues with several trilateral summits and the declarations up to 2013 when this coup took place and Turkey's and Egypt's relations soured. More recently, they formed a new international organization called East Mediterranean Gas Forum. So Egypt, Israel, the Greek Cypriots, Greece, plus Italy, Jordan, and Palestine. These excluded Turkey, which has the longest coastline Eastern Mediterranean. So it didn't make much sense excluding the longest coastline country, little country. So finally, in August 2020, Greece and Egypt signed a maritime deal, the delimitation agreement, as we know. Then Turkey was frustrated by that. So what was the Turkey's counter policies against these events in the region? Firstly, Turkey insistently said that Eastern Mediterranean sources cannot be shared without the participation of Turkey and the Greek Cypriots. So that's why Turkey took more aggressive stance and the unilateral actions to make these parties to take Turkey's concerns into consideration. For instance, in 2011, Turkey sent its seismic survey vessels to north of Cyprus, and it kept doing that later. In November 2019, Turkey and internationally recognized Tripoli-based Libyan government signed the Maritime Borders Delimitation Agreement. Turkey, as we know, Turkey also military engaged in Libyan civil war as well. And on the side of government of national accord, which was the international recognized government, and this changed the course of the war. So in the favor of the government of national accord. This action stimulated an international reaction from multiple sides, like the Emirates, the Egypt, France, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and they formed a form of coalition, geopolitical coalition against Turkey on the side of Haftar. Turkey's following drilling activities on the disputed waters in Eastern Mediterranean increased the tension between Turkey and Greece. Turkey and Greece had debate over this exclusive economic zone sharing. This is an exceptionally serious conflict for both sides because it's a matter of sovereignty. That's why it bordered a hot war between those countries. These developments almost landlocked Turkey to the Anatolian Peninsula. And this also caused a geopolitical containment anxiety for Turkey beyond its energy concerns. Turkey adopted this blue homeland doctrine developed by naval officers to overturn this multinational isolation by force if necessary. And all these developments I mentioned worsen the political isolation of Turkey in the region. So this is the situation right now, and as a brief summary of what happened. So first, I will start with what's rhetorical entrapment. They explain what's rhetorical entrapment. Rhetorical entrapment is rhetorical public commitment to a principle that lacks in the speaker, so they cannot argue against the already accepted principle, like without appearing inconsistent or losing their credibility. Actually, Frank Schimfeling produced this concept to understand the EU's this big Eastern enlargement because the rationalist arguments fail to sufficiently explain this development. However, his application of the concept is focused on institutional environment and the norm-based discourses of a singular country may also lock in itself. So in this Schimfeling's argument, it was about the EU's norms, but a country by itself, a singular country by itself can lock in itself as well by using enduring norm-based discourses or narratives. So these speech acts of political elites can bring about foreign policy outcomes like constraining national interest-driven behavior, and the social resonance and audience receptivity might cause such unintended consequences for the country. So this is basically what is rhetorical entrapment. Now I will start to talk about how Israel had a place in Turkey's discourses. In the during the AKP government, Just and Development Party government, in the early years of its rule, the AKP government used more careful rhetoric against Israelis' operations, like 2006 Lebanon war. General theme was the Israel uses disproportionate force. It was repeated. But later, they harshened their rhetoric. For instance, the Israel's assault on Gaza Strip in 2008. These assaults defined as cruel and crime against humanity by the AKP elites. And this rhetoric constructed Israel as aggressive and morally inhumane. The most dramatic turning point was, as we all know, the Erdogan's famous Davos speech in 2009. He blamed Israel for intentionally killing Palestinian children, being murdered, cruel, barbaric state. Then Israel's military assault on the flotilla heading to Gaza and killing 10 Turkish civilians in 2010 happened, as we know it also, Mavi Marmara incident. This incident irreversibly, so far, changed Turkish elites' norm-based rhetoric towards Israel. Israel's this operation defined as illegal, bloody, inhumane, state terrorism, and also the AKP elites' discourses depicted Turkey as the defender of peace and oppressed Palestinian Muslims. 2012 also became a year that Turkish elites sharpened their rhetoric towards Israel after the Israeli attacks on Gaza Strip. For instance, Erdogan stated that the killing children, cruelty, murder, injustice are in the nature of Israel. So it's very essentialistic contentions and arguments. Also, the foreign minister Davutoğlu defined the Israeli operation as a crime against humanity, ethnocide, inhumane homicide. So AKP also maintained this extremely strong norm-based and morally demonizing rhetoric in the following years. Here are some examples they used to define Israel, like barbaric state of terror, master of children killing, committing genocide, killer of women, children, elderly, oppressor, and so on. So there are more. So these all very strong expressions. In 2016, they became closer to normalization, driven by the shared interest in Eastern Mediterranean. But the AKP elites softened their tones temporarily. However, the process failed, and Turkey turned back its discursive position quickly. In 2017, the US decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel triggered a new wave of anti-Israeli rhetoric. Some examples of the statements AKP elites in the following years of this decision, like Israel is terrorizing the region, Israel is a state of terror, we won't leave Jerusalem to the hands of a children killer, invader, a looter state, and Israel is committing a genocide, Netanyahu is the head of an apartheid state. These are very strong norm-based expressions, so which bounds the speaker. And what about Egypt? So how Egypt positioned in these discourses? The AKP elites immediately defined the intervention of the Egyptian army in 2013 as the intervention as a coup d'etat. So Erdogan's, like, one of the first statements was, what's happening now in Egypt is the operation of majority by the minority. So according to the AKP politicians, the coup government of Egypt was not legitimate, and the Turkey's struggle depicted as cause of democracy. So of course, this rhetoric caused a backlash from the Egyptian government for meddling in its internal politics. So the violent intervention of Egyptian military in the anti-coup protest, jailing and death penalty sentences hardened the AKP elites' rhetorical tone. And the AKP elites had begun to resort to direct analogies between Turkey and Egypt frequently, like pejorative vocabulary borrowed from the Turkish domestic field, like military tutelage, like status quo, anti-democracy, elitism, authoritarianism, national will. These kind of vocabulary also, as we know, weaponized against the secular bloc within the country, and it's used in the same way against the Egyptian government. The AKP politicians defined the Egyptian military's misconduct, causing hundreds of civilian deaths, as barbarity, savagery, cruelty, tyranny, planned intention massacre. During 2016, like the Israel case, we heard some voices from the AKP elites which held out an olive branch to the Egyptian government. However, the political relations between the two countries were still far from being restored. More recently, Erdogan, in the Libya case, during this Libya turmoil, furthered this governmentally normative discourse towards Egypt and made this analogy between the Haftar's rule and the Egyptian coup. So, although Erdogan admitted that Turkey and Egypt discussed the matters of confrontation via intelligence agencies, this national interest-driven conversation didn't end well because of this recent Greece-Egypt maritime deal, and it didn't herald us an imminent detente for the sides. So what all these discourses mean for the Turkish foreign policy, or the possible moves in the region? So some of the most important strategies, like geopolitical experts and politicians in Turkey, like including this retired admirals, Cem Gürdeniz and Cihan Yaycı, who are the champions of Turkey's Blue Helmet strategy, voiced that Turkey's rapprochement with Israel and Egypt and signing a maritime deal with them would strengthen Turkey's position in the conflict very much. According to this widespread rationalist opinion, even though Turkey's conflicts with Greece and Cyprus are hard to solve without concessions, solving Turkey's political frictions with these countries are more trivial and does not require Turkey to renounce its national interest. On the contrary, there are very strong rational incentives in building bridges with Egypt and Israel for both sides. According to this argument, Turkey can easily compartmentalize its relations with these countries as it's doing with Russia for a while. However, the Justice and Development Party government still is not pursuing such policies, despite material incentives and widespread national interest-driven recommendations. These diplomatic preferences of the AKP demonstrates the limits of realist or rationalist reading of Turkish policies in the region. Here, I contend that Turkey, under the AKP, rhetorically entrapped by its long-standing norm-based discourses, morally demonizing Israeli and Egyptian governments. The discourses of the AKP elites narrowed the diplomatic room for Turkey to move in line with its national interest in Eastern Mediterranean politics. So can they change it? According to Luke Glanville, the post-truth age makes it easier for actors to break these rhetorical constraints and the commitments. Even though a change in policies and discourses is not impossible, enduring value-laden rhetoric towards these units increase the cost of this potential move for the current governments. So they can do, but there is a cost for that. Or a political transition of power within a country would always make it easier to break the country's link from the former government's rhetoric. Like if a change happens in Turkey, the government change in Turkey or Egypt or Israel, these things might change easily. But if they stay, it's still keep being problematic. Therefore, we can finally conclude that as long as the AKP and the other actors in Israel and Egypt stay in power, the rapprochements would be hard and costly for the AKP government, despite clear national interest in such policy. So thank you very much. This was my presentation.
Thank you, Mustafa. We are going to discuss what you're arguing about Turkey's policies in the region and its relations with the regional countries such as Egypt and Israel. And I'm going to give the floor to Hussein AL-AHMAD. His presentation is about the mediatization of Palestinian split in pan-Arab transnational satellite TV journalism. The floor is yours, AL-AHMAD.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the Sakarya University for being this. It's my deep pleasure actually to be with you in this Congress. and it's the mediatized conflict. My paper discusses the Palestinian internal conflict as one mediatized conflict. Can you see the screen with me?
Yes.
I have my screen, but not sure if you can see it. Anyway.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, thank you.
It does work. No worries. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. So, and please, I'm not feeling well. Perhaps you hear me coughing sometimes, so apologize me. Again, thanks for the opportunity. And for those who do not know about the doubt that anybody know, but to explain it, the Palestinian split was embodied in a political dispute over power and ideology, which erupted in 2006 in the wake of the Palestinian legislative elections between the two main parties, Fatah and Hamas, two major and powerful actors actually in the Palestinian political scene. As part of the Middle East, with its milieu of increasing turbulence, authoritarianism, and political competition, systematic propaganda become in high demand amongst regional ideologies competing for territorial dominance.
Mr. Hussein, if you can.
Yes, please.
Mr. Hussein, I mean, if you can do a full screen your presentation, it will be great.
A full screen?
If you can change, if you can able to change your PowerPoint to full screen mode,
oh, yeah, I will.
It will be great. Thank you.
Is it better now? Okay, now?
Yes, that's great. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thanks for noting. So again, with the comprehensive, powerful influence of pan-Arab satellite TV journalism, they outweighed most of other means of in attracting the public attention. You know, they have their own platforms and other social media and the internet also, so they have the power to attract more attention than other medium. And both Palestinian parties had deep connection to the regional agendas. Hamas with the pro-Islamic camp, pro-Iranian predominantly, and the Fatah with the secular ideology with the pro-Saudi camp, which is an extension for the pro-American camp. And political actors on both sides tried and sought to external support, chiefly to socialize their own narratives and gain more social sympathy towards their narratives. So my paper explored the transnational political communication between regional and Palestinian political actors through the pan-Arab satellite TV and news media during the Palestinian conflict. The theory of mediatization refers to such interplay as a struggle between the political logic and news media logic over the news production and the news media message. Informed by the theory, I examined how such two-way transnational political communication between the regional and the domestic political actors take place. Also, the aims each player in the interplay attempted to achieve through the mediated reality shaped in these channels journalism. The analytical focus is in behind the scene interplay between the regional and domestic powers, the struggle between the political logic and media logic over the production of message. So I have two conditional and interrelated variables actually in this interplay. The one is the value that the political powers in this journalism and the need that the satellite TV channels aim to meet by adhering to the will of these political powers and adapting their policy and their agenda. This converted to the 3 or 4 main research questions. What value or values did the regional political powers sought in the seek in the regional satellite TV journalism, and what need the channels aim to meet? How did the value and need interplay, and how that was reflected in the Palestinian political culture? My method investigates the key characteristics in the process of news production rather than going into the content, the media content per se. Actually, I started with the critical discourse analysis, then I thought also about the content analysis, but I was making the study actually in the Institute of Middle East and in the Arab and Islamic Studies in the University of Exeter, and Professor Ilan Babe, the manager there, noted with me that it may be better to go to the characteristics of the engagement itself. And other colleagues also advised me to go to the another point of view, and I chose the informants' perceptions. Informants, I mean the participants in the interviews, and those, my primary qualitative data source, gathered through 30 semi-structured, open-ended questions, interviews with the 30 high-profile stakeholders and key players in the Palestinian politics and the media industry, identified as the informants. Those actually are key leaders in the two parties, key figures in the media and political scene in Palestine, media analysts, and media scholars, and so on. Case studies were Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, Al Mayadeen, as the three main or key channels in the scene, were selected as case studies. Each channel, as we know, have its unique and its audience, belonging, and ideological background. Units of analysis were hot stories. I focused on the hot stories during the conflict, like the conciliation round, the schemes between the forces in two parties on ground, and so on. I focused on the framing of news fit to the channel's financial interest, how the news and the events of these stories were framed in a way that served at the end of the regional powers. My informants' point of view was significant because they are well-informed and influential segment in the Palestinian society, actually, both with the geopolitical context and the media politics boundaries. They act as the pulse of the Palestinian politics, being involved in political reality in a daily sense. When hosted in these channels as pundits or analysts, their depiction of the reality impacts both of the public opinion, also the political processes in the conflict. They offered first-hand scrutiny, actually, of the pan-Arab satellite TV news coverage in terms of its nature, in terms of the motives behind the framing of news. My theory of mediatization addresses the interrelationship between news media, politics, and society, between the media logic and the political logic, and how that affects the society, how news media become important player in political systems. It's primarily applied in political communication in early ages, during the mid-80s, to study the media's influence in politics, with special focus in the TV media more than any other media like press or so. It discusses how framing of news narrows the choices of current events with which the audience can engage. Also suggests how the audience should think about these events, the way they should think about it. So choice is the basic act that transforms essentially private thoughts and values into public activity. That's its public decision in the public sphere. So my key findings in the study that the politicians were always interested in reinforcing their Palestinian ally stand. A victory for the Palestinian ally is a victory for the regional camp, and maximizing his public sympathy, while the channels were interested in framing the news to bargain it for propagative value to gain the financiers' support. Data shows how to attain these aims. The channels and the channel's performance was contingent upon two main factors. The first is the way in which the channels transform the conflict actors' claims, interpretations, and prescriptions into media content or news message through framing. And the other factor is how their ability to amplify these contents and endow them with public reach, visibility, and of course, consonance through manufacturing the news value to gain the media attention through the framing, priming, and agenda setting. So the interplay between the two different, albeit interconnected systems or logics of news media and politics culminated with political logic to colonize the news media logic because of the absence of democracy in the land and these Arab states engaging in the Palestinian domestic politics. The pan-Arab satellite TV journalism played an instrumental role, an interventional role, serving the interests of regional financiers, mainly in the Gulf states, their instance in the conflict itself. Other findings relate to how the ownership and financing sources were two crucial factors on the performance of the regional satellite TV journalism. Also framing information and news and shaping the perceptions of the Palestinians were a valuable service that the channels created and were appreciated by the regional political elites in their proxy competition, primarily after this is an effect that enhanced after the Arab Spring and the extension of the gap between the two camps, with the Qatari politics maneuvering between the two pro-American and pro-Saudi and pro-Iranian camp. While trying to serve their financiers, the channels participated in the exacerbation and the perpetuation of the Palestinian split. In terms of conclusion, the study concludes too much with the federalization or the postulation in the theory of mediatization in terms of how the media role alters in times of conflict due to the emerging domestic geopolitical interests. Also, during conflicts, how societies become vulnerable environments for the influence of media interventions. Also, news media intervening in ongoing conflicts. This happens when power and political ideas are presented in a way that influences the political reality and how it's covered on the ground. Other conclusions relate to how the channels fought to achieve victories without much consideration of professional and ethical standards and its implications on ground, even when this coverage facilitated the demolition of the nascent democracy in Palestine in its whole history. Also, this type of coverage in the pan-Arab satellite TVs remind us of the ancient paradigm of state-run media we used to watch, which supposedly lost its rule with the advent of the satellite TV journalism, albeit potentially not. On the ground, the lack of democracy hindered the performance of free media. Pan-Arab satellite TV journalism adhered to the financiers' policies, agendas, trying to serve their ends. The exacerbation of the perpetuation of the split become a byproduct because we doubt that the channels intended to exacerbate, but their performance lead to such consequence. As deduced from several informants' testimonies, mainly the leaders in the two parties, this is a very vital and crucial conclusion that the Palestinian will alone is not enough to turn the end of the split. One major conclusion, and the other is how the role of satellite TV journalism is vital medium in promoting or hindering civil, touristic, political culture, and the unrestricted public sphere. One theme that I intend to continue my research on relating to the media rule, the pan-Arab satellite TV media rule in other Arab countries, with the ramification of the Arab Spring and how media can play positive or negative role. Examining a Western-based theory in non-Western context was one key contribution that I think I managed to achieve in this study. Others relate to the aims of both media and political institutions, how they intersect through the news production and reflect the power political ideas are mediatized, presented in a way that influences the political reality. And thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much. I came to an end.
Thank you, Mr. Hussein. So thank you, all of you. I think we listened three great and strong presentations. All of them have a very strong argumentation about their relevant topics. Now it seems that we have received three important questions. I would like to also add two questions, one of them for Cemre and one of them for Hussein, Mr. Hussein.
Yes,
first of all, I would like to start with Cemre. I would like to ask all the questions, and I'm going to give you 3 minutes to answer all the questions that you were posed directly to you. I would like to start with Cemre. Cemre, you think that is there any continuation between Obama administration discourse and Trump administration discourse in terms of the critical discourse analysis or you know, the implementation of this theory into the American foreign policy. And Mustafa, you have actually two important questions. The first one is about Furkan Halit Yolcu's question. What will be the best option for Turkey to relieve itself from rhetorical entrapment and being landlocked to Anatolia? This is your first question. And your second question is coming from Serra. To what extent do you think that Turkish discourse affects the foreign policy decision-making process of Mediterranean players and external forces like France, the EU, towards Turkey? And your question, Mr. Hussein, is coming from Ayşegül Yolcu. Which one do you think is more effective in the mediatization of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the TV or the newspaper? My question is about how you think about the impact of the structural dynamics of fake news and the post-truth dynamics into your questions. Okay, Cemre, the floor is yours. You have 3 minutes or you have 2 minutes. I mean, if you want, you can add more. We're going to start with you. The floor is yours, Cemre.
Thank you for the question. As I said, there are different sub-strategic cultures in every national context, so the US have them too. I talked about isolationism and internationalism, and these are actually broad terms, but when we look at Trump, he also feeds from this different sub-strategic cultures. We have in the United States the Etonian tradition that puts America first, as Trump argued. So in practice-wise, they actually somehow supported the same thing, like footprint, not interfering that much with Middle East. But in discourse, of course, Trump didn't hold anything back. So he said everything he supported, actually, he did on the ground, on the contrary of Obama. So Obama was more internationalist in his views of freedom, democracy, and wanted to spread that. What Trump was more, I don't want to say exactly isolationist, but he did have these tendencies about isolationism. So no, of course, there's somehow continuity in practice, but not in discourse.
Thank you, Cemre. Mustafa?
I'll answer the first question. The best option for Turkey to relieve itself. Firstly, I need to put that I agree with his arguments. Turkey needs a rapprochement with Israel and Egypt. I agree with that, firstly. But how it can be done, as we see, for instance, in 2016, when they tried to have some kind of rapprochement with those countries, they slowly started to change the rhetoric. Like Erdogan, there is Erdogan's expression that in the region, Turkey and Israel each other, whether we like it or not. So he said that. And also he, maybe some of you remember that he blamed the flotilla organization for not asking him before sending the flotilla there, this humanitarian relief there. So we know that Erdogan is a pragmatist politician, so he may prepare the stage first, rhetorically, prepare the stage first, and I think they would take the discourse of national interest. They will, I expect that the relation, if they start, the relation with Israel and Turkey, in order to change this rhetorical entrapment, they will use a national interest rhetoric, like it will be kind of, the team will be kind of like temporary evil. Like they will define that, so yes, we know that these guys are bad, the Israeli government is doing these nasty things, or the Egyptian government doing these bad things, but like as a temporary evil, so we need to have relations, or they can justify rhetorically that we can help Palestinians by good relations with Israel, or we can help Egyptian people with Egyptian government, having good relations with Egyptian government. But somehow they will need anyway a rhetorical justification for this change. So I think this might be the discourses these discourses can be used, employed to change the course of the events between those countries. I hope this answers the first question. For the second one, how this affects the other countries' foreign policies, what we see in the field that generally those countries, the leaders of those countries, take these discourses of the Turkish politicians in the times of elections, or when they use it for the domestic consumption. For instance, what we see recently with the exchange of statements between Erdogan and Macron, and Erdogan's this mental problem expression for Macron. So we saw a reaction from the French government after that. So, and we know also exchange of furious statements between Netanyahu and Erdogan before, when Erdogan blamed the Israel for like a bloody, inhumane state terrorism and etc. So maybe some of you remember, the Netanyahu said that, okay, you cannot lecture us because you are bombing the Kurds. So see, and it was also a rhetorical one against Erdogan. So I can't say that, for it's my opinion. I think these other countries are more flexible when it comes to national interest than the norms. So because we can think for a second that if Israel made these really harsh comments about Turkey, it would be harder for Turkey to act. But Israel still, so you define this country as a state of terror. So you call it as terrorism, what they are doing. So, but in 2016, they were okay with this rapprochement. So I think that they are taking these discourses seriously, less serious these discourses than we take it. So that's I think if we approach them, they will be more ready to engage with us. But of course, there are also the hard facts, like the Turkey's hard relations between like a Muslim Brotherhood and other hard facts. But in terms of discourse, they would be flexible, I guess. Yeah.
Mustafa, do you follow the Egyptian media or the Israeli media to see how their prime minister or president are talking about Turkey? Don't you think that they don't have, or they have actually a very soft rhetoric against Turkey?
Yes, I agree. So I think comparing.
So what is the difference between Turkey and its counterparts in terms of using the harsh rhetoric against each other? What are the differences? Why are you, recommending Turkey that Turkey should, change its rhetoric in order to change its foreign policy practices?
I think the rhetoric used by the Egyptian leadership or the Israeli leadership, comparing the Turkish discourses, I can tell it's softer, but still, generally what we see about the supporting terrorism argument they were using, for instance, in Egypt, or for the Hamas case. But as we saw in firstly, I need to put that there are some hard facts and hard facts in the field, like Egypt's relation with Saudi Arabia, Israel's own policies. So firstly, we should take into consideration these factors first. If you only focus on the rhetorical part, I think because the Turkish discourse is more strong and enduring, I think, than the other sides, it will be easier for them to change policies than Turkey is able to do it. For instance, Turkey, Israel takes, you can hear the name of Israel more in Turkish public sphere than you can hear Turkey in Israeli public sphere. This is what I'm saying. So that's why they are more flexible, I think. So yeah, I think they're more flexible.
Thank you, Mustafa. Mr. Hussein, the floor is yours.
Yeah, in terms of mediatization, it's a theory of high modernity that looks at the TV, primarily at the TV and the internet, not to underestimate the newspaper influence in people in terms of its intellectual influence, but it's the TV that have, it's by far the most powerful tool of humanization and control. Television has strong suggestive power, as said by several media media scholars like Strombach, like Wolfsfeld, like Schultz. For instance, also Gandhar and Mohan, everything television has become the preeminent and if overwhelming dominant source of national and international political news, more than the newspaper is. So the TV have its symbolic, have its this spectacle that is formed by the facilities, the huge facilities in the satellite TVs nowadays, and its extension of correspondence and networks make it more powerful than any other outlet. And if you take a look at the new form of newspapers, like the electronic newspapers, you can see how the satellite TVs feed these websites as a source of the video footage and the credit. If you want to make sure of something in the Facebook, on the social media, you directly turn to the website of the BBC or the Al Jazeera and so on. So the mediatization comes firstly through a new modern technology, through the spectacle that is tactfully made by the TV industry, and how that penetrate our awareness and our thoughts, our attitudes, and how that is reflected in our behavior, mainly the political participation. So TV absolutely is the most powerful medium in the mediatization of conflicts.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Hussein.
You're more than welcome.
You want to add something?
No, thank you very much.
Okay.
If you want to.
All right. Thank you, all of you. And I think this panel is very, very fruitful. So the title of the panel is The Middle East Through the Lens of Discourse and Media. This is the panel organized by Sakarya University Middle East Institute. And thank you for all of you again, and hope to see you for the next panel and organization. Thank you, Mr. Hussein, Mustafa, and Cemre. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.